And I just wanted to start off actually talk a little bit about what happens or seems to happen every semester, sadly enough. And that is that every semester that I teach this chapter, and this actually happens with many chapters because there's a lot of crossover in sociology, but every time I teach this, something happens during one or multiple of those days that relates directly to this, directly to our history. Because if you remember the beginning of the class, I'm always asking that we remember the past and the nowish and then the future. And we can apply that with really anything that we're looking at: total institution in prison, or teenage pregnancy, or race. And so I think it's really important for us. We could discuss it, or I can at least talk about it. I know that we're at a point in the semester when the energy isn't like very, very high. That doesn't matter. That's for other classes. But for this class, I wanted to talk today, to intro this, about what just happened in Georgia. And that pertains to race and race relations. And so, of course, because we're going to talk about voting, there are politics involved, but this isn't a political piece. We are talking about this as sociologists and in sort of response to, or looking at things from as value neutral as we can possibly be. But what's been going on with the laws that they passed that really do amount to voter suppression and racism in Georgia it's really awful to see. And so we've got a legacy in the South of gerrymandering. We've got a legacy in the South. And we could go back a couple hundred years. We could go back to slavery. We could go back to when we said that people of color could finally vote. And you had to pass a written test in Chinese, in another language or something that you, of course, would never be able to do. So even when people of color got the ability to vote, or won the ability, or granted the ability, or whatever, we finally followed through on our promise at a local polling place, that was almost never the case for, decades and decades and decades. So when we look at what has happened over the last 2 months, it's really been like something I can't wrap my head around from almost any perspective that I look at it. And that is over 250 some presentations by the GOP Republicans. And again, this is the party of my grandfather, aimed at limiting voting and limiting voters' rights and limiting your participation in this democratic republic. And it's been kind of under the radar, although now nothing much is. And so we've been hearing about it, but it culminates in this really big bill signed into law yesterday or today in Georgia, which is, directly pointed at communities of color, directly pointed at limiting and disenfranchising. And now this is nothing particularly new. Again, this is a very historical piece, and particularly the GOP continues, instead of to change policy, to limit people of color in poor neighborhoods and impoverished areas, to limit their ability to vote. And it really, I tried, like I said, to understand it. And I guess I get it if you're no longer participating in democracy. But I don't see any other reason that you would, in a democracy, take away people's right to vote. And now we're in this big thing where it's like, well, you can't possibly infringe on the Second Amendment. Well, it's like, seems to me like people are happy to infringe upon the right to vote, particularly when it impacts people of color. So what standards are you working by? Apparently none, in that you will fully infringe one, but not the other. And I would say the right to vote, being able to be accounted for, that's like the most democratic, fundamental thing in the world. So why do we historically aim these things or target communities of color? It's important to understand. It seems ridiculous to think broadly that all Black people would vote for any one party. So why the tendency coming from one party to limit the ability for certain people of color, minority folks in this country, to have the same access to voting? And I'm going to say this is quite possibly one of the worst in my lifetime. I'm 47 years old. worst things that I have heard attached to this bill makes it a crime to approach people who are in line to vote to offer them food or water. I'm waiting. I'm waiting because it seems like we are way into Jim Crow territory. It seems like we are way into violation of human rights territory. And it seems like if we tried to apply this to dominant culture, I'm pretty sure people would lose it. And so all I'm trying to do is not people of European are to be guilty and oppressed. You know, that's never my approach to race. But what's the end game for not allowing people to approach people and give them food or water when you've made it so that they have to stand in line for 17 hours to do the most basic thing? Your most basic democratic right. So remember, this is not a political soapbox, folks. This isn't even close. This is a chapter on race and discrimination and power and access. And so you tell me, where is the gain in a democracy from purposefully limiting people of color, communities that are at risk, limiting their voice? And I think I would guess it has something to do with these states continuously not being interested in the policies of the past, the racism of the past. And so all of a sudden, these red states are blue. I mean, it's not that simple. It's not red versus blue. These are, where do you have access to vote, and in what counties are they literally in many states limited, and they just happen to be the states that were in challenge, right? It's still typical states in typical places. Just going out of their way to limit to like one voting place per county with no advanced voting, no mail-in voting. But I think they finally crossed the line in my mind with a human rights issue. Now, are people responsible to bring their own water? I'm thinking of it from a functionalist perspective, their own food and water, yes. But who does it serve from a functionalist perspective to have the people in democracy have to wait 20 hours to vote so that they might pass out, so that they might get dehydrated and have like physical harm? Is that really the goal of this democracy and that functionalist perspective? Because it seems to me that the inequality is obvious and targeted, and it's targeted at historical populations of people that I'm just not sure when we're going to stop doing this. I do not get it. And now that does not mean that every Democrat wants to expand voting for people. But in the last couple of weeks, I've heard people from the GOP say, oh, well, really only certain people should have the right to vote. Like, who exactly are those people? And once we're in college and we start to dissect it, I think we know. And so to me, the racism is so overt and the disdain for poor people is so extreme. So extreme. How extreme, Jason? Because you seem extreme right now. I'm always saying that in my head. Now, extreme means you're willing to have people have bodily harm done to themselves because of long lines. And do you know how hot it is in some of those places? Do you know what's locking your knees if you sing in a choir in a hot auditorium for 10 minutes is like? I mean, we're also talking about people in these demographics that may not be the healthiest, maybe obese, maybe like that's a very difficult thing for these people to stand in line for an hour. For me, in the summer heat or how hot it could be. So anyway, consider the human rights when we talk about this. Consider who this is directed towards, and a sociologist. Oh yeah, you can pass out. Oh, you throw up, you pass out. That happens at concerts all the time. I see people who aren't, because Julie and I spend our life going to concerts. So I see non-professional concert goers, like at a Bob Dylan show, where there's maybe an older demographic or people that don't go to concerts all the time. You don't see it at the Grateful Dead. People are like, those people are professionals. They got 20 water bottles strapped to them. They've got all sorts of drugs. They've got a tent in their backpack. They've got sunscreen, 10 different kinds of organic sunscreen. They got food. Those are professional concert goers. But yeah, wow, the thought that you have to like pack survival gear to vote, that to me reflects poorly on the system of democracy. And then when you know that you're targeting at certain people, it really seems have we lost our minds? Yeah, law that basically says someone asks you for water, you have to give it to them because it gets so hot there. Yeah. Again, the things that I'm saying here, I'm recording this. It's not unreasonable. This is racism and discrimination and institutionalized racism. Why? Well, why isn't this directed at communities of wealth and communities of affluence and communities where people are even middle? Like, why? Can you imagine in a middle class or affluent neighborhood having one place to vote in your entire county? No, people would be outraged. Just the number of older residents would write so many letters. They would end it. It'd be madness. So why is this okay for communities of color? Like, why is it okay to stand up and be long-winded and give huge speeches about how this is protecting voters' rights when it is just thinly veiled racism and discrimination? So look, if you've spent the last 30 some years like I have, or even a few years in the body of a person of color or working for race relations, you would know that this is what's going on. I'm not making something up here. And believe me, I support not one single political party or ideal that seems ridiculous to a sociologist. Oh, or at least to me, it seems ridiculous. So, all right, we can make this better. We can get more people to vote. We need to help people. And I love that Uber was getting people there. I loved it that the post office was really working hard. Now they're like, oh, well, they're all behind. They did their job. They helped democracy. But before the last month, in certain places, they were ordered to dismantle like sorting machines. They were taking away mailboxes and places where people could drop off ballots. Now, come on. You can't imagine that around here. Around here in Colorado, they put out extra ballot boxes in LaPorte so that the elderly people that live in rural areas can vote more. But those are different looking people and they have different histories and different dynamics. So yeah. When I was younger, my mom would give people free rides to voting booths. I just don't see the harm in having people more accessible to democracy. That seems, in fact, more democratic, but who knows? I guess I must be some crazy hippie. Although I'm not. Wow. Well, anyway, I stand with my brothers and sisters of all different colors and nationalities and races, but I can't stand for anything like this that's overt racism. So hopefully people work even harder at that state level to get people the food and supplies and water and equipment that they need to vote. Geez, like people are climbing Long's Peak or something. Sorry, I gotta let the dogs in. Hold on. Yes, there's all the doggies. All right, so we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about deprogramming racism. We're going to look at the Jane Elliott Blue-Eyed, Brown-Eyed study. I've gotten the chance to work with Jane Elliott at Luther College in Decorah, Iowa. She's very, very well known, and people actually, I think, know more even about now than about Jane Elliott this last year, since the BLM movement and issues of race have not suddenly, but again, as usual, and persistently come to the forefront. Okay, so let's pop back here into a screen share. But remember, everybody, that's what a democracy is. It's a muscle. And if you don't flex it and you don't use it, it can go away. If you don't try and protect it, it's easy for people within the system, because we just got done talking about stratification, to design ways to disadvantage people for their own benefit. So let's work hard against that type of non-democratic type of ideals and for people's rights, particularly people who have not had access for a long time. So what is race? What are race and ethnicity? Like I said, we tend to use them, interchangeably, but they really do mean much different things. And I would say this, for people that often hear this or even agree with the idea when you hear this, well, can't we just stop talking about race? I wish we could all stop talking about race. I wish it wasn't so darn important. Well, we have to remember that people who are of a minority status did not determine how much and to whom and to what degree race matters or mattered. So they're not the ones responsible, really, even now, for how much race matters. Though dominant culture will put that on disadvantaged culture, um, dominant culture has decided that race is a foundation of identity and a basis for social inequality. Wow, that's a pretty big deal then, right? That's a huge concept. So socially constructed category of people who share some biologically transmitted traits that members of a society consider important. Now, important doesn't mean valued. It could just mean a way to make you distinct enough to be discriminated against. All right. So race refers to a socially defined group of people who are generally considered to be distinct in some way from other groups and are generally considered by themselves or others to be a distinct group. So, you know, race is socially constructed, but it has a few biological components. And one of the hangups or problems with race, the concept of race, racism, and discrimination for so long has been that focus and over focus and overemphasis on biology, which we have already touched based on this semester, making it the thought that this is just how it is biologically, therefore we are dominant. And by reinforcing that biological method, you know, it's not about slavery and you making free money. It's about who's really predetermined to be in these positions anyway. So we're just doing what we're supposed to do. Sounds harmless enough if you say it like that, but of course we know it's not, right? So, race, however, because we're acknowledging that there's some biological component, has a couple different components, right? When we're breaking it down. And of course, and I think that my students now, you know this, you're savvy enough before you even read the chapter, we hear race and ethnicity, but we know they mean different things, right? And they're completely different concepts. So we'll get to that. So social group identity must be recognized in some way by its own members as distinct, and physical. Every race is generally regarded as being somehow different in appearance from other races. Now, what people in dominant culture, people of European descent, have made a very, 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 very big deal about for many, many, many hundreds, if not thousands of years, is actually, you know, comes down to very little, right? It comes down to melanin, it comes down to geographic location and where you've been, it comes down to migration. But what it doesn't come down to is genetic difference, which is where, or the feet of which it lies, the ideas that have been presented for so long. Given that definition of race, is there such thing as the ginger race? No, but just because that's not the case doesn't mean that you shouldn't apply as much sunscreen as possible. The kind, I think, with the zinc oxide that doesn't absorb into your skin, the kind that actually makes you look like an actual ghost. That's the safest. And believe me, if you live in Colorado, even closer to the sun, super important. No, I actually play in a band called Ginger Whale, and we're kind of like Tenacious D. It's a comedy duo, all for gingers. We even sell our own sunscreen. We do, because I love Jack Black. But no, not really. And really, it's the human race, right? We're only looking at a few pieces of differences here. And ethnicity gives us a much more cultural and social background and a much broader idea. Race is just sort of a beginning piece. And again, it is a social choice to define what differences matter and how much they matter. You know, the same is true of gender. This is not an innate biological piece. If there's anything, if you're giving life to people, then women are innately biologically superior in every single way, it would seem. But no, of course, we know that that's not how these things are determined. It's a social choice. It's how society is structured. We just got done with that. And furthermore, for people that want to say, again, can't it just not matter? Can't race not matter? It does. And you're the ones that have decided how much. So let's put more effort into doing something about the inequalities. And maybe as we start to even the playing field and recognize people and giving them the same economic and other opportunities like we would see in other cultures, then it becomes less of a thing, right? And by that, white culture, dominant culture usually means by that, I don't want to hear this always. But those are the inequalities that are established. And if it's uncomfortable to hear, so be uncomfortable. You know, there's worse things, likely having to live in a culture and be the minority, let alone feeling bad, right? So, in a very technical sense, why do we display racial characteristics? And of course, again, what I just said, you know, traveling around the world, living in different regions. Do you live next to the equator? Or do you live someplace where you don't get much sun and you're covered up for most of the year because it's very, very cold? A lot of these variety, these racial, or excuse me, a lot of these, or a variety of these racial traits, product of migration. And if we're all going to look back at it, and we should, all life, human life, comes from Africa. You know, that doesn't give the right for folks that are, you know, European to claim that they're African, but need be reminded that you are. And so these differences are not, they're just not there except for with the social weight that you've given them. Now, of course, scientific concept is inertia, right? We've mentioned this, or maybe we haven't, I'm not sure, but if something is going on and on and on and on, it is a fact rolling downhill that to stop it, you need to meet it with equal or greater force. And this is very much something that's true in regards to racism, okay? And preferential treatment. My dad the other day, who is 80 years old and prone to watching Fox News from time to time. He's a teacher and he's a musician. Teacher for 30 years, musician for 30 years. Grew up in the same town I did, which is very diverse. The older he gets, the grumpier he gets. The more he watches Fox News, the more I worry about him. But he said to me, "What do you think about this reparations thing?" And I said, "Well, I think that you've known lots of people in your community of color that haven't had a fair shake and could use a bit more of a fair shake. I also think that reparations is never going to impact you in your life." Like, it's something that is an emotional trigger by dominant culture, like affirmative action, to keep you angry about something that will likely never impact you, except for to uplift people, maybe a tiny bit in your community. So again, when I hear my dad talking about reparations, I know it's in the news. And I do know because we're talking about it in Illinois and a town that is taking care of this and trying to address the past in that way. But again, those types of things seem to dominant culture highlight the differences when we know that there are very little and for very few reasons. So melanin, no melanin. You probably do anyway. The pigment that gives us our skin color. Protects skin from ultraviolet rays associated with various skin cancer. And of course, populations living near the equator have darker skin to protect them from the impacts of the sun. So, you know, really, you've got changes throughout the year, of course, in non-equatorial populations of people, and there's a lot of other factors. How about the availability of food containing vitamin D? Most people now are not getting enough vitamin D. Like most people are quite, they're finding out vitamin D deficient. You get that in a lot of different ways, or you can, but now through supplements because we're not getting a lot of it through our food system necessarily. Regional cloud cover, the amount of clothing that is worn. And then there's things over time, the amount that you're inside, which is why we are less. I mean, you're talking to a guy that's not very hairy here. There's not one hair on this chest. Well, maybe one lonely hair. But that's because people aren't outside as much. And I'm talking about for generations and generations and generations, right? So the more we're indoor, the more this is changing as well. The more that people are becoming diverse and traveling the world and having families that are diverse, you know, this is an inevitability again. So it really amounts to white supremacy when we start to hear these attempts to convince people that there is such a notion as a pure race. There's not, and not even close. And really sort of hang on to these ideas of discrimination and prejudice that most in culture have moved past. And we know that most have because our values, beliefs, and norms are different than they were even 60 years ago or 70 years ago in 1950, right? Very, very different in regards to what we're talking about now, race. And in some ways, you know, the same. We oftentimes come to think of race as biological or genetic, although there is an inability to really for people to agree. How many races are there? Are there 3? Are there 34? Is it 1? Race classifications change from time to time, from place to place. Just like culture, it is consistently variable. Long-term interbreeding between races makes the notion of a pure race in a biological sense meaningless. Even places that try to accomplish that aren't accomplishing that. So on a biological level, or from a biological point of view, knowing a person's racial category would allow you to predict nothing about them. Okay, so again, and I had that in the last one, but here, because this is going to be a question on the test, and when you are talking to people about race, it's going to be one of the most important concepts that people who aren't professional sociologists, like you are now after 9 or 10 weeks or whatever it is, are able to say, which is, listen, race is socially constructed. Okay, and why things matter, how much they matter, whether we reward somebody or punish somebody, those are all social constructions. So talk to the people who have been making them and reinforcing them instead of trying to level that playing field or dismantle those ideas. So how do we look at race as sociologists? Coffee. 1, as fluid and historically changing. Okay, how folks were defining race in Europe 200, 300 years ago is different now than it was long before that. It's also something that Europeans invented in the 18th century. Okay, so obviously the construction of it, important, not important, different people, whatever, previous to this, but the notion of race, superiority, the thought that certain people, and this was done as part of colonialism, this was used to seize an entire continent of Africa and North America, as if people didn't still live there and they didn't have their own culture, and there weren't lots and lots of them, which there were. So the reason that race is invented is to discriminate, right? Is to give preference to someone over someone else by suggesting that those people are biologically, therefore naturally inferior and less human than the people who are creating the definition. And now that anybody who would listen to that and be like, that's ridiculous. What? That's totally what human beings do. I'm making the rules. I'm better. We know that. Stanford prison experiment. We know that. Blue-eyed, brown-eyed study. When people think that they are we know that. So many things. When people are in control, they oftentimes exercise that power. When they have a disproportionate amount of power for some reason, they don't always use it well. So of course, the people that come to define race are the very people that use it to discriminate against others while denying the existence of that discrimination. I didn't say this was going to be easy to unravel this, folks. This is something that I've studied for almost my entire life as a point of interest, because I grew up in a very diverse place, and just my love of the musical community I grew up around and the friends in my own community, I just couldn't get it. And I still don't at 47. So we're still processing these ideas, still trying to see how we can dismantle this. But you literally have people denying that there was a violent insurrection at the Capitol, while saying that the BLM protests, which were found to be like 90% peaceful, and the violence was instigated by law enforcement, somehow we yet continue to turn it on the same folks that are looking for a share of equality. So again, this is nothing new. And even if, and we know that racism and discrimination are built on a foundation of lie and mistruths, that is why they exist. They still exist. They have impacts. That sucks. They're built on a foundation of lies. That's good. That means you can cut that out from underneath it, show people what the actual truth is, and get someplace with this. This is not like gun control or many problem, gender issues, many problems that we face. It's not some impossibility, but it's going to be tough, right? Once we examine what agencies of power are in place and what they want to do or not do about racial equality, human equality. All right. The third thing that's tricky then is that we've come to see race as fixed and universal, but it's not. Once we see a certain number of boxes that you can check, or a certain number of races that carry with them a certain number of historical momentum, then this is what we expect. And that, of course, that gets into the definition of specifically prejudices and stereotypes. But we can't deny the existence of these things. We can't deny the existence that what happened a couple of weeks ago or whenever it was a hate crime. and it follows a pattern of systemic abuse against Asians and Asian Americans in this country for a long, long, long time. These issues, we don't look at them because they just, oh, there they are today. They don't happen in a vacuum. They happen with a great deal of historical precedence, which we use to understand where we are, right? And where we're going to be. So, well, Jason, what's it matter then? Well, it matters because race then are these categories on the basis of how we perceive human beings, reward human beings, or punish human beings, and as a justification for discrimination. Well, that basically sounds like that's going to impact my entire life. And it does. And it does. And that's why we are trying to look at race as not fixed and universal, as within a construct of our time that, of course, includes inequalities. The thought that anyone would deny that boggles the mind. But again, it's not about that, like, well, we identify those inequalities that you feel bad. It's all to move forward or in a more positive direction. So again, those categories, it is about what characteristics we choose to pay attention to and how we classify people based on those characteristics. Now, the census, it gathers actually important information. I think of these things that were on like SATs or things like that. It would have a box that would say race. I would put other, and then I would write in human. I don't know. That was just always my tendency. Nobody told me to do that. I just didn't get. And I think that that's why it's interesting to look at from a socio perspective. Why the hangups? Why the discrimination? Why the massive amounts of inequality? Isn't it true that a river works better with more diversity? You can't pull things out of that chain. The biological, controls won't work right. It won't function right. Same is true with transportation, right? Multimodality, more diverse transportation means it works better. Human culture works better the more diverse it is. Okay. So in the 18th century, and race, now we're getting to a couple concepts here which aren't science at all, but have been called race science or scientific racism. And European culture obsessed with it, obsessed with a couple things. And one thing would be cementing the fact that these physical attributes are valued more than others and continuously perpetuating that, and then exploiting the people that you ranked as lower or subhuman for whatever you need them for. So simultaneously, then I guess the third thing would be alleviating you of feeling guilty for treating other human beings in this way, right? So it's intense and it's deep. And it was in the academic communities forever and ever and ever and ever and ever, and still is. Oh, the other thing that came up in the news yesterday, a football or basketball coach was fired because the name of the plays that he was forcing his players to call were anti-Semitic. Like, what? Like, you can't call it the number 34 or the blue runaround. You've got to call it the whatever. So to me, again, this seems ridiculous in the context of 2021, but it's reality. There's a lot of thought and effort put into discrimination and prejudice. So there's got to be a lot of thought and reality into deprogramming it, right? So, physical attributes become part of the definition of race, developing in a race science, 19th century, according to stages of evolution. And here's the European descent skull next to the African skull, next to an orangutan or an ape. People are stupid. They still are. I'm sorry, but they are. You flash these pictures up and people are supposed to think, oh, that's right, those people are closer to monkeys. I can treat them without an ounce of human decency. How is that any different than what they're trying to do to people in neighborhoods of color with this voting piece? I mean, again, it seems very, 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 very similar. And I'm glad that in the last chapter we looked at ideology and what does ideology means and who sets that ideology. And then, of course, how do we change that? Whoa. Read this. Read it because it's racist. Okay. Jason, why would you want me to do that? Because we need to look at the past, right? So that we understand it. But this is just a long explanation for why humans that come from Africa, now the Native Americans are related to orangutans because they have red skin and orangutans have red fur. And just the ridiculous lengths that people went to, people of European descent, to justify this. I don't know how you define somebody who is, sane or insane by the way their head looks, measuring their skull. I maybe had some of those pictures before. But now we can look at the Human Genome Project, and we know that genetically all human beings are nearly identical, less than, and know this, and tell people this. Okay? If you are, a lot of my students, why do I say tell people this? All I mean is, a lot of my students are interested in how you can dismantle racism, or how they can make an impact on their friends that have attitudes and beliefs that they think need to be improved to be more positive or less racist. Okay, well, we are less than 0.01 of the total gene pool, or less than 0.01 of the total gene pool contributes to racial differences. I mean, we couldn't be more similar, is the takeaway from this. And yet, you have these organizations that continue to thrive. And they only continue to thrive when they get political backing, and when they get money, and when they get media coverage. And so, yes, you do awaken white supremacy when you suggest that there's some good people there. And why is that? Well, because decades before a few years back, when those words were uttered, we have a collective agreement that that is not the case. Again, how do we know? We know because of our laws. We know because of the emergence of hate crimes. We know because we are getting further towards equality. And then, of course, this type of thing here. So important to understand that, race science is not correct. People are more physiologically similar by far, maybe a few varying traits. There's no genes that can be linked to race. Yeah, again, it's not a political piece. It's just that it's been on display recently more outwardly, and I do refer to this last year where the president was in Minnesota saying that they had good genes, and to a very white audience. That type of behavior coming from anybody can't be normalized, right? It is a big deal. Because it's used to lead to support and lead to discrimination, and real big types of discrimination, not access to housing and healthcare and jobs, and good gracious, the number of people, percentages of people who are minorities who are in prison for offenses, like statistically measurable pieces, right? Just because I'm curious, not to catch you on your soapbox, that's all right. Is there no genetic link to racial differences? Then why do people of some color have the same color? There are some very small, like we're saying, there is, and I mentioned this at the beginning here, a biological component to it. And those people have been in those areas, and those people, I guess if you're talking about people of European descent or something like that, but it's going to change the second that that's not the case, or people of various backgrounds or cultures, have the next generation. And I don't mean to be, certainly I don't want to be on a soapbox, but I am passionate enough about what I think is less than our potential to continue to define and redefine, or continue to give any kind of voice to people who would suggest that there's a pure race. We've utterly debunked this with science, right? We have used science. So there is no, now we know it's socially constructed, but we have looked at this and said, in as far as superiority, yeah, there's some very small genetic piece to be sure. But we redefine, and I have it at the bottom here, define and redefine race because of political and religious and social interests, right? And not every piece of privilege is an outward sign of overt racism by any stretch of the imagination. And we'll get to this. All right. Let me go back to here. Also, there are biological factors like hair texture, genotype, phenotype, or different things. Color. Yeah, absolutely. Right, which are the physical distinctions or similarities that people generally regard themselves, like I said, and are regarded by others to be distinct. Okay, let me get over here and see where are my questions? Okay, what does your ethnicity mean to you? All right, I think that this is more complete. Huckle. No. Uncle, here's the presence of the vehicle. We live in the country, so that's enough. That's enough to set him off. What? There's one car on our road? Um, okay. Question is, what does your ethnicity mean to you? And I think it becomes obvious, like I said before, that ethnicity is a much more comprehensive term. It means a lot more, and explains a lot more, and divides people quite a bit less, and gives distinction, and credit and credence and love to the individual components that people bring from different ethnicities and their different backgrounds, cultural backgrounds. So let's look at this. What does your ethnicity mean to you in a few words? 3 for privilege, where I come from. My ethnicity is an example of how hard my papa worked to come to the United States. As someone who is Latina and motivated, or that is motivational, that my papa is a doctor and was able to learn English later. Therefore, my ethnicity symbolizes my ancestors' struggles and tough work ethic. Awesome. Yeah, awesome. Fantastic. Very cool. Mainly brought up by others. Cannot have an opinion. And you know, I have to stop, I guess, at this one. You can absolutely have an opinion about what your ethnicity means to you. Some of my ethnicity means that my family really celebrated St. Patrick's Day, and I had to eat corned beef and cabbage. Yuck. I love it now, but as a kid, I was like, what? And Dad was definitely going to be drunk that day. Is that a stereotype, Jason? I'm just telling you, in my very Irish family, what the expectation was in my family. So yeah, there's never a point at which anyone in this class should ever feel ashamed or guilty for their race or ethnicity. What's the point? Nothing. There is not. You should be proud if you want to be, if you're Norwegian, and you have Viking hair like Zion and Julie's that just grows and grows and grows. And I don't know, you should be proud, whatever that is. So when I see something like that, and the only reason I stopped is because the other one said cannot have an opinion. You most certainly can. And I want to reel us back a second, because I like fishing. I'm gonna reel us back a little bit. And say that we don't want to go victim. We do not want to go victim as people in dominant culture. And the thing that really, I don't get is the rich victim thing lately. Like, why am I becoming sympathetic for somebody that has billions of dollars that wants to say they're the victim when they say something racist and get fired? That's not cancel culture. That's accountability. I grew up in a time in the 70s and 80s with all sorts of accountability, like I mentioned before. So let's not go victim. You can have an opinion. It's important, whatever that ethnic background is to you, or whatever cultural components that ethnicity means. So don't think that that's not, the case. Nothing special. Really don't think about it. Unfair advantage, pride. So I think some people are also, we have some overlap here between the concept of race and ethnicity, which is good because we're going to talk about how very different those are. Cultural traditions, stories, or experiences passed down from generations. Yeah, who wouldn't want to be proud of that in their family? I mean, or at least, what are those stories? Again, I find that's a great answer. It's a privilege to be unaware of privilege, your heritage or culture. Where my family and I are from, cultural identification, very important part of who I am. Nothing. And see, I love that. I don't love it, but meaning it could be, this is why race is so important, because it could be it could run the whole spectrum. I really don't care. Change it tomorrow. Yeah, I got some advantages, but that's not a big deal to me. I'll give them all up, whatever, to people whose entire lives are impacted of it, or it's a big part of their identity. The countries that older generations of my family are from. Right. Ooh, yes. My ethnicity is where I come from, part of my family's culture. Ethnicity is where you're from, what your culture is, my identity, who I am, where I come from, heritage or background. No different than any other person, gives a sense of family history, majority. Cultural traditions, part of my culture. Here we go. Yeah, that's some of the bigger ones. Cultural group you belong to. Basic, don't know really. Right. Family ties. Oh yeah. And not just that show that I watched in the 80s, which was a really good show, actually. Valerie Bertinelli. Why am I Back to the Future? Michael J. Fox. All right. I digress. Okay, so our ethnicity is part of our shared cultural heritage. It's part of generations before us. It's part of the things that our grandma and grandpa or great grandma and grandpa passed on to us. Ways of thinking, ways of being, tools that we use, how we raise our kids, so much. And we'll get to that next time. But I want to stop for a minute. We've got about 4 minutes. Any questions about this? About our examination of race, ethnicity, looking at it in this perspective. And again, yeah, there's no right political party. This country on many sides of the aisle has hundreds of years of inertia of not doing the right thing in regards to race and recognizing people as equally human. That's not a political issue, that's a human issue. And a human rights issue that, you know, that people I think are working pretty diligently towards, which is very positive. Oh, I saw some kid, I saw like a first or second grade boy that was dressing up as his hero, and his hero was Amanda Gorman, the poet. And I was like, I'm sorry, this is the coolest thing, because in the middle of a basketball game, because you know I'm a big Bulls fan, the other night, or maybe you don't, whatever. A poet, and like there's nobody like in this auditorium, but they usually had entertainment. They're finally bringing back halftime entertainment, even if it's just an empty arena. It's very cool. But they had a poet reading some amazing poetry in the middle of the basketball game. I think that is the coolest thing in a space and time and age where people aren't as, we don't sit down and do quiet things like poetry much anymore. We're not with ourselves sitting by a stream without the live stream. Oh, dad joke. Yes. I'm going to leave class there for the day. Please be good people, do good things, stay safe, mask up. Julie just got her vaccination yesterday, her first vaccination. She works at a grocery store. She's had a really intense last year. Yay! Science, right? It's like, the more you know, knowing is half the battle, and also science. Yeah, that's fantastic. Very cool. It's about to start raining hypodermic needles here in Colorado, I guarantee you. So you're very important still. If you're not getting, if you haven't been vaccinated yet because you're younger or whatever, you are important. Stay safe. And then eventually you'll have that opportunity and be able to go to some concerts and hang out a little bit more. And now I guess, you know, that'd be cool. But within the parameters of be good people, do good things, stay safe, look at the assignments, work on the Food Matters project, work on the Food Matters project. Hey, Jason, what's the perfect thing to do this weekend? I don't know. What's the perfect thing? I say work on the Food Matters project. Oh, that sounds totally fun. I'm not selling it very good, but you could probably have a nice iced tea and like face your laptop towards the beautiful mountains and type a little bit about food. I don't know. I try and have that section 3 as well, so that you learn something maybe that you didn't know, or you could do something that you're passionate about. So if you still have any questions about the project, I want you to do very well on it. So yeah, peace be. Have a great weekend. See you on Monday, everybody. Take care.